Good evening and welcome to Plain Talk. My name is Christopher Ram. Thank you for joining me for the next hour. And let me take you back some 24 years ago on the evening of Good Friday, April 9th, 1993, when the body of a 19-year-old woman, a security guard, was dumped from a speeding pickup vehicle in the vicinity of Geddes Grant Building, now Courts, on Main Street, Guyana. There have been lots of discussions and talks, but her killer and those who conspired with the killer perhaps have never been brought to justice. It was with some hope perhaps that last year the acting Commissioner of Police indicated that the matter was still a live one, and he also volunteered that procedures were breached during the initial murder probe. One hoped then, which was August 2016, one hoped then that something would have come of that case. In fact, I'll use this opportunity to call on the Minister of Public Security and the Commissioner of Police and the Crime Chief that they should bring out that file and subject it to the most careful scrutiny. There is no statute of limitation on murder, and I have no doubt, though I don't know who it is, that that person is probably walking and maybe driving the streets of Guyana whilst Monica Reese is dead and her mother is mourning her loss. In the aftermath of that tragic event, a group of persons, Father Hardless from the Catholic Church, Clement Lai, a social and civil society activist, Richard Humphrey, formerly of Hotel Tower, Josephine Whitehead, attorney at law and activist, and I got together and we formed an organization called Guyanese Against Crime. Unfortunately, we weren't successful in bringing about any resolution. In fact, the group for several weeks was the victim or the object of sustained attacks by then the late Police Commissioner Laura Lewis. So it was with some sad deja vu that we read earlier this month that another young woman, a school teacher, one who dedicates her life to the teaching of our young minds, was found unconscious on the side of a city street, succumbing later of those injuries. We understand 3 police have been questioned in investigations. We have not heard a lot since then, except that we've heard senior members of the police force indicating that the criminals and the perpetrators of that horrible murder of this innocent woman would be brought to justice. To discuss this matter under what seems to be a rather anodyne and a neutral topic, violence against women. This is extreme violence against women. Are 2 women, Akola Thompson, a newspaper columnist,
Hello.
And Ms. Karen DeSouza, well-known women's rights activist, she's spent her life trying to get justice for the poor and the oppressed. So, Ms. Thompson, Ms. DeSouza, thank you for appearing on Plain Talk.
Thank you for inviting us.
Akola, that's an unusually long introduction. But it's because of the significance of it. Against that backdrop, do you wonder, well, what has changed?
With regards to the Monica Reese case, we were actually talking about it today and the amount of similarities. Oh, no, sorry. I do a kind of...
I meant what was your circle when you were talking?
Yeah, well, it's a live Facebook thing we do every Wednesday, and sometimes we invite persons and we talk about certain social issues. And today we were talking about the role of the media in victim blaming. So the Monica Reese case was brought up in relation to Kesia's case, sorry. And we were looking at the amount of similarities between the two cases, and it was just kind of really, as you said, it was deja vu, because when you look at the details of Monica's case and you compare it to Kesia's, then you see how similar they both are. Because I was reading some of the news articles about Monica Reese, and in some of them you saw things that they could not necessarily find who did the murders, because there were things in the paper such as she would have had sex with several persons and the same day she would have died. And that's one of the reasons it would have been so hard, because, you know, the image they gave was of a promiscuous woman. So that was one of the things. When it comes to Kesia's case, the framing is also kind of similar. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's one of the similarities I definitely saw between the two cases.
Could you say, for the benefit of the viewers, you said the framing is similar. In Kesia's case, what were the circumstances that have been put out there?
Okay, well, so far I've seen the story being aired across several channels, but so far there was one story in particular that caused concern for me, because when I first saw it, I automatically, when I saw the person saying she was being touched inappropriately, and then we were given details that Kesia was moving from bar to bar, she seemed to be intoxicated, and this was something that was continuously repeated, that she was under the influence of alcohol. And I mean, you really have to think about certain information and the relevance to a story, right? Because as a journalist, you have to be very cognizant of the way certain things are framed. Because if you say that, if you put out an image of a young woman, a party goer, somebody who likes to have fun, then automatically people will begin to blame that woman for her own death. And it was very apparent in the responses we saw. People were commenting, oh, she's a teacher, she's not supposed to be out late at night, she's 22. She's a young woman. These are things that we at 22 years old, we do, right? Yeah, so that was definitely very disturbing.
Karen?
Well, I mean, whether we're talking about Monica Reese or Kesia or any other woman that has been beaten and killed by her partners, by people close to her, it always comes down to victim blaming. So there's always, well, she had to do something to invite this abuse. You know, there's something that she did wrong. She upset the man. She didn't cook the man's food. She answered back. And unfortunately, there is also a school of thought that suggests maybe the woman should not be so provocative. Maybe she needs to submit more. Don't answer back.
Cook the food.
Cook the food on time and so on. So
and make sure it's warm.
But yeah, it got to be hot. I mean, you can't give the man cold food. So it's this culture that we're living in that continues to even in 2017, that continues with the view that the woman must be submissive, that the woman must be responsible for the abuse that she's receiving, that she can do something to prevent that abuse, because of course, this in order to keep this husband, she must know that she must behave appropriately. And that culture, we seem not to be doing enough to shift it. We're not doing enough. So in the case of Kessia, I'm hearing, since I'm not on Facebook, I'm hearing all the nasty
It's a generational thing.
Yes.
all the nasty things that are being said about her. She's not supposed to be out. She's not supposed to be at the club. Why would she go off with a policeman, no less? So it is something that we have to address, and I think enough is not being done, and I don't think that, notwithstanding the laws that we have, I don't see that the justice system is working in an integrated enough way, and I don't see that the social services we have are active enough within the law, within the framework of the law, to address the things that need to be addressed. So really and truly, in terms of how women are addressed, and Monica Reese was for me, I think, a watershed moment in terms of the kind of slide into a certain kind of vicious crime against women. I may be wrong, but that's for me a kind of marking point of violence against women. And it does precede the Domestic Violence Act. So we have a descent into a certain kind of acceptance of violence, and it's, I'm saying violence against women, but we're also talking about interpersonal violence, the violence in the schoolyards, the violence in the communities, the official violence to the powerless citizenry. So we are in a really violent country, and we seem to be so accepting of it, whether it's physical violence or economic or verbal. We just accept it.
And you're suggesting that it's violence right across board, right across gender. But is there a particular trend that one has noticed about violence against women?
Yeah, I mean, gender-based violence is a particular, I guess, section of violence in a total set of violence. Gender-based violence, and I mean, what is violence except the use of superior power and force against somebody weaker? And that essentially is what gender-based violence is. Women are seen to be less than, notwithstanding our laws and all the chat about equality and so forth. There is still not widespread acceptance that women should be equal. The structural arrangements make women unequal.
Structural meaning the economic and social.
Yes, and institutional arrangements. Yes. So women are unequal, notwithstanding the laws, and within the household and within intimate relationships, women continue to be unequal, and it does not matter which economic sector they come from; they are unequal. And so for me, that is the basis of this ongoing violence against women. What explains the increased brutality and the real viciousness in some of the violence? I don't know how we explain that.
Do you think, Akola? I think there was one where the woman's both hands were chopped off. Was there an issue like that a few years ago?
Yeah.
How do you explain? As a young journalist, you talk to lots of people. What's the explanation for this, as Karen said, this level of brutality?
Okay, firstly, I'm not a journalist. I'm a columnist at the Guyana Chronicle. And, well, the reasoning behind it, I think it comes back to a lot of what Karen said with regards to power and power dynamics, because when you think about it, it comes back about how women are viewed as inferior, how even though we have all these progressive movements now and we see that women have far more rights than they did before, we may have equal opportunities for certain things, there are still fundamental barriers that keep us from achieving certain things and living safe, healthy lives. So it really has to come back to the entire culture that surrounds this idea that women are seen as inferior and men as superior. Because when we begin setting up that dialogue there, then automatically what we're doing is we're setting up a place where it's okay for women to be harmed, it's okay for women to be killed, it's okay for their stories to be in the media, to be misrepresented. So when we begin setting that up, everything just becomes easier and easier for us to do.
Karen, you were active even in the days of the Monica Reese story. What was your impressions at that time as to the attitude of the society and the role of the police?
I don't know. I think, I mean, for me, there was a certain kind of misbelief that the police could not find who did this thing. There seemed to be, as I recall, a flurry of activity and reports that people were being picked up and questioned and so forth. But then nothing happened, and it was. It was, I think something kind of broke in the society, that there could be this dramatic crime, and that there would be absolutely no result coming from it. So even with the victim blaming then, even with the attempts, and maybe that was a way to try to excuse the fact that the investigation was going nowhere, because of course she's a poor person. Maybe she wasn't worth the effort that it would take to bring the criminals to justice. But it was clear that there was a shift in terms of what was happening in the society, and what we were going to be able to expect in terms of both the official responses excuse me, and I guess the protections that we could anticipate or depend on based on who you were. Of course, if you're middle class, you can always expect to be protected, but clearly if you're not middle class, moneyed and wealthy and well known and so forth, don't bank on that protection.
Do you think that the failure of the police then contributed to this feeling, the perpetuation of this, that look, nothing is going to change? And even the police are saying 23 years later that the review clearly indicated an unprofessional course of action was taken that year, and period, the matter was on investigations. Does that surprise you?
That unprofessional things were done? Not really. Since I have been the victim, since I myself have been the victim of unprofessional behavior. But I don't know. I don't want to put it all on the police. I think yes, of course they're a part of it, but they're a section of this society that we're describing, and I don't expect them to appear to be any different from the rest of the society. So we all have to up our game.
Except that they have a duty to protect.
They do. But how do we, if we're not living in a place in which officialdom as well as the citizenry will demand better standards, why would the police behave any different? I mean, what is there to make them? What's the standard to which we're going to hold them? We don't seem to have a sense of standards at any level or anywhere in the society. So why would the police be any different?
What do you think the police ought to do in connection with the Monica Reese matter now?
Oh, you're asking me this?
Well, both of you. No, questions are always open.
Okay.
But Karen needs to have a drink.
Yeah. Okay, with regards to the Monica Reese case, I was I was doing some readings on it earlier, as I mentioned, and even from those articles, you could sense that something was just not quite right. You could sense that there was a cover up there, and that people were just not being forthcoming with certain information. Now, the case has been reopened. That is one good step. That's one move in a positive direction. But no.
Well, I'm not sure that's been reopened. This was August 2016.
Mm-hmm.
It's well over a year.
True. Well, that's very true. So I guess we do actually have to look at that aspect of it. It's been open for so long. One of the first things we got from the story was that something went wrong. People were doing some major cover up, and we never got to know who that person was, what that cover up was. And so I think that first and foremost, we really need to begin to question what really happened. Why are we still not getting this information, and what new angles are there exactly? Would it be interfering with the investigation if they release this information to the public? Because that's always a concern when you release certain information to the public, that it will impede an investigation. But when it comes to the Monica Reese thing now, I think that it's happened so long. There has been no leeway into the case, no insight really, no real insights. But yet we're being told that certain things would have happened at this time. People are not held accountable. And now we know who those persons are, but yet nobody's still being held accountable. We need to question why that is necessarily. Could it be that they are in high positions? Maybe they died. It's so long ago. We don't know.
So you're suggesting that the police ought to really make a statement as to where we are in this investigation?
Yeah, it's about time. As you said, it was since last year. We haven't heard back anything else about this case. One of the last stories I read about this case was about the supposed wrongdoing that they had back in the day. So we definitely need a lot more information where it's concerned.
Let's turn to this issue of the gender-based violence widely, but gender-based violence. Does it cut across ages as well?
Well, yeah.
Definitely, yes.
Does it take place within the teenagers, the young adults?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that happens is that when we grow up, we're all conditioned a certain way. Even if we try our hardest, even as parents, if we try our hardest not to condition our children, it will happen. Society will allow that to happen at a certain point. Now, when we do that now, we have teenagers who grow up with these thoughts that I have power over this person because I might be from this class, I might be from this ethnicity, this gender, or something, some kind of power they have over this person. Now, when we have that, we even have this in teenagers where we see persons get involved in relationships, and we see the teenage boys, they would be beaten up on their teenage girlfriends, and we need to acknowledge our role in kind of letting this kind of behavior to run loosely.
Karen, you've been exposed in a lot of cases with the Domestic Violence Act. How much has that act helped to curb, if at all, the level of domestic violence?
I wouldn't say it's helped to curb the domestic violence. I think there's a lot more reporting. There's a lot more speaking out. There's not enough leaving and addressing it. And I'd say after quite a few years, the courts eventually began to use the Domestic Violence Act in the way it was meant to be used, as protection for women who are going to the court, and men who are going to the court for protections. There's still a lot to be done, but it's not enough to say to a woman, you don't have to put up with violence. There are all kinds of reasons why women stay in violent situations. Mm-hmm. Not least economic and financial reasons. And those have to be addressed. The social conditions have to be addressed. In terms of prevention, we have to teach our children differently. But at the moment in the school system, we're still saying it is okay to beat children. We're still saying that it is okay for an adult to settle a disagreement by hitting a child. And this is what we teach in the children. If I don't agree with you, then I will use my superior power and strength to deal with you. We're not teaching them how to reason. We're not teaching them how to use their words to debate and settle differences. And that's where it begins. So there's this big move to speak about the problem being in the family and so forth, which is kind of a circular argument, because if the families are the problems, if there's problems in the families, then how can you bank on the family sorting it out? So something else has to be done, and we have to put the resources into that instead of these massive billboards that are being put up all over the place that mean nothing because the place is filthy.
So what would you do? What do you suggest?
We need to have community programs. The Ministry of Education needs to abolish corporal punishment in the schools. Teachers need to be taught alternative methods of dealing with kids. We need to have social workers trained in the schools to address children with real problems, because children are not born bad, The problem child is coming from a place with problems and expressing those problems in various ways. So at the same time that we try to make the laws work, at the same time that we put the support in place for families in need, the state has to take a hand in the schools, has to put the resources in the communities so that the support is there for the families that need it. We can't be on the one hand be complaining about the issue of teenage pregnancy. So we have children raising children and expect any good result coming from that if we're not providing real support. And I'm not talking about the small program that a little NGO can do, which is going to probably touch 50 teenagers when we have thousands of teenagers that need services and resources. So the resources are somehow just being frittered away in ways that are not hitting the mark at all.
Akola, have you witnessed or experienced or learned of how the court system deals with domestic violence? I know, Karen, you've appeared in courts on a number of occasions on this matter. What's your view? Do you think the court system is sufficiently resourced and understands the problems of domestic violence?
Well, I don't have a lot of experience in courts, to be honest. I've never really actually been into the court. But I don't think that we have enough resources, particularly with the amount of cases that we have. There's a lot of backlog always in the courts, so there's not enough resources. And when it comes to domestic violence particularly, I think there needs to be a lot of training, sensitivity training, because when you go into a court and say you're a victim, and then you have a magistrate or a judge or somebody who's saying to you that your matter is not necessarily that important, or we have people going to court and being turned away because their case is not being their case is being taught as wasting the court's time. I know that recently, well, this isn't the court necessarily, but this is the police. People would go to the police and they'd be turned away. They'd report their domestic violence problems if their partner was beating them or harming them, and they'd be turned away because the police don't believe them. They don't believe that they can offer solutions, or they just say it's a man and woman story. A lot of times when we get into these things, we hear it's a man and woman story, and so we're reluctant to actually broach the issue because
which is part of their training problem, though, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely it is a problem, because when we begin to say that, then we begin to further normalize the violence against women, because we say, okay, she might be angry today, but tomorrow she can go back to she man, and then, well, our involvement in this hasn't seen any results really, because as we see it's been, as Karen said, people stay in relationships, violent relationships, for various reasons. And I actually used to be one of those persons who would say, if you're in a violent relationship, just leave. I thought it was that simplistic, But when you take in all these other different factors, and you kind of analyze them, you see that sometimes it's just not that easy. So when we come to the court system now, we have to make sure that our lawyers, our judges, everybody at every single level, we need to make sure that there is, I don't even know if sensitivity training will do a lot, but we just need to put a lot of procedures in place to make sure that victims are not further victimized when they go to get justice. And we need to ensure that when persons go to seek that justice, they're not turned away on some basis or the other.
Turned away or turned off.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the court system has been doing a lot of work, and I think there's enormous improvement in terms of how the court is handling cases that women take them, whether we're talking domestic violence or sexual assaults. The problem, notwithstanding all the training that has been done with them, is the police. It continues to be the police, and it's, for me, a real systemic issue, because frankly, I don't think the police are taking it seriously, notwithstanding their slogan about, no tolerance, zero tolerance. They like to say zero tolerance for violence and so on. But in terms of making those internal arrangements within the police force to ensure that in every single station, every report is taken seriously, that has not been sustained. And a lot of the training has just kind of frittered away. Which is why you would still, even now, have police saying, that's man or woman story, or woman make it up. Or, tired taking reports from this woman, because she can come back and beg for the man. Yeah, that is true, and that's part of the violence syndrome. But the police job is to take the report, to investigate, and to deal with it. That's the job. That's why you're getting paid, and that's why you're in uniform. So it's not just about training, it's also about institutionalizing the arrangements which will make that which will put that training to work, and that's not happening.
Early on in this program, I think it was you, Akola, who said, who was drawing attention to the fact this victim blaming story, she just dressed inappropriately. She was out drinking late in the night. She invited this on herself. I got to be very careful as a male.
Yeah.
I know.
Karen,
I know.
I've
seen it. How does one deal with a situation like that in a conservative society? For whatever we say about it, it still has very conservative values. Whether we're talking about same-sex marriage, we had a constitutional amendment that was rejected because of fear of those, the homophobes, which is a real shame. But that's a different story. How in a society like ours, how do you overcome that backward thinking? And I hope I described it appropriately, Karen.
Absolutely. But it's a lot of these deeply backward and more politely conservative people, including these men who can't do housework, can't stir a pot, whatever. If they happen to leave this country, sometimes the jobs they do involve cleaning and cooking and so on. And certainly at home, they're doing these chores. So it's not impossible for them to learn. In the same way, the drivers who could ignore the highway code here, when they leave here to go drive in another country, suddenly, as well as the litter bugs, they drop garbage all over the street. But when they leave Guyana, they know that they have to find a bin to put the garbage in. So it has to do with the framework within which these people are operating. We have laws. I think we have to ensure that the laws are enforced. I think we have to make those laws work. But we also have to do the public education. So for example, instead of looking at a large billboard with the Minister of Finance's face on it, proclaiming a budget to come, why don't we have a large billboard saying don't litter or don't hit your wife or don't beat your child? So something that really moves to have an impact on this culture. We have a Sexual Offences Act, because in this open season against women, it's, babies are being sexually assaulted, very senior citizens are being sexually assaulted, and our Sexual Offences Act is without a doubt the best in the Caribbean. Very modern, very forward thinking, recognizing the rights of victims and so forth. As far as I understand, the magistracy and the judiciary are dealing with it, dealing with how they implement this law and so on. The stumbling block is the police. And the services that need to be put in place to ensure that this law works properly, which means that the government has to put resources into it. There needs to be a lot more in terms of court support for survivors of sexual offenses, more training of psychologists and all kinds of things, because we can't underrate the kind of damage and long-term damage that is done to a person who has been sexually assaulted. But we're not seeing it, So this law was enacted in 2010. 7 years later, the judiciary is putting its house in order. The government is not. And the law lays out the things that needs to be done.
You want to add to that, Akola?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things Karen talked about was about toddlers, young children, and old people being sexually assaulted. And when it comes to the issue of victim blaming, I think it's important to look at these cases, because often when it comes to victim blaming, we particularly if there's a murder or sexual assault, we tend to look, if it's a woman particularly, we tend to look at what she's wearing, how she acts before her death or before her sexual assault. We tend to look at where she was, what time it is, all of that. But then in the case now, when you have a child or an elderly person, if they are brutally raped, they're brutally killed, then could we then say that they were also asking for it? Can a 1-year-old say that, okay, I am morally loose, then maybe I'm asking for this, I'm deserving of this? And then when we frame it that way, I think you realize how ridiculous it really is. Because not because someone is dressed a certain way means that you get to approach them a certain way or do things to them without their permission. I mean, I remember one time I was actually in high school. I was now in high school, Form 1, and I'm in my uniform, and a man just passes and slaps me on the buttocks. That is harassment, but I was not asking for that. I was in school uniform. I'm a child. So how then could you necessarily blame me for that? And then, so when we think about these situations, we need to be very careful about the way in which we say certain things, because then, as I said, it further permeates a culture in which women feel as if they can't necessarily be safe. I don't feel safe walking home. Every night I walk home, I have a knife, I have something sharp, because I've been robbed before, I've been beaten and robbed before, and there was nothing ever came out of that. So women are always under the constant fear that they will be violated when they leave their home. I know women who frankly don't leave their home after 6 o'clock because that's nighttime, and that's very dangerous for them in their opinion. So when it comes to victim blaming, we really need to be very, very careful and just not do it. We cannot blame the victims for being victims.
We have you go to government offices, they always tell you, oh, you can't be sleeveless.
Yes.
And you can't.
That is part of the problem. That is part of the problem. I know, well, we've had some success with that recently. I know we did there was some public awareness and there were some protests also that we were involved in. And afterwards, there were some places like the National Library. That was one we were particularly happy about. They removed the dress code, and some government institutions, but still.
The GRA, you go to pay your taxes and they tell you, well, you're not appropriately.
Yeah. But even now, we still have many places that still have the dress codes, and women are being sent away. We have people coming from
Dress
far
code
away.
in inverted commas. I
Yeah,
guess.
and when you look at it, it always affects the women more. You see a long list of what women are not allowed to wear, and then you can see some little short thing about what the men not supposed to wear. And I mean, when you constantly just policing women's bodies like that, it's not surprising that people take certain messages from it and says that if you dress a certain way, then I can harass you, because when we put dress codes like that, then we're automatically telling the woman that,
Indecent.
cover yourself, you're indecent.
Do you share that view, Karen?
Yeah, there's way too much focus on, I don't know, things that are really not important,
Yeah.
as opposed to the content. These government offices, instead of fretting about who's wearing slippers and who is wearing sleeveless clothes, deal with the service that you're supposed to be providing. Make it more efficient. Come to work
Yeah.
on time. Do the work you're supposed to be doing. Leave my clothes alone. So it's a really upside down focus, and of course the courts are ridiculous in this regard.
Absolutely, because you were saying good things about the court,
Mhm.
but in that they have not.
No, they have not advanced as far as I'm aware.
No, they haven't. And lawyers, I tell you, some lawyers really hate some of the clothes they have to wear. The men, are men speaking out enough against this evil of violence against women?
Well, they're not.
Or is it part of the culture we talk about
Waiting
it,
for
we
that.
talk about it? It's rhetorical, but what can be done?
part of the problem is again that we have all these boys clubs around the place. So the man might know that his friend is an abuser, but it's his friend, so he's not going to call him on it. He's not going to say that this is wrong. But it's professional loyalty, party loyalty, straight friendship, family loyalty. We just will not recognize that there is a principle here, that no human being should be battered. No human being should be hurt in the way so many women are being hurt. And there is no excuse for meeting that kind of hurt out to another human being. So regardless of the relationship, then call it, tell the person that they're wrong, you can't do it. It's not acceptable. It's criminal. And then push the law to take its course. So it's no, men are not speaking out enough. There's a very small minority of men who will speak out, but definitely not enough, not loudly enough, and not often enough.
Yeah, and when it comes to men speaking on certain issues, a lot of times when they do speak out, it's usually against women, against something that we deem to be proactive. I mean, for instance, we had recently there was the Me Too. Oh, I know you guys aren't all into technology and stuff, but
I didn't say not into technology and not into Facebook.
Well, the social media types then. Well, we had the Me Too campaigns, which was sort of a solidarity hashtag then to talk about sexual assault and violence. And many of the responses then were the men. And when the men did show up, their main aim then was to kind of derail the conversation and say, oh, well, not me or not anybody I know. They just kind of refuse to acknowledge their role in the systematic oppression that just kind of plagues women. And when you kind of think about it, a lot of times when we talk to men and we want them to speak up, we want them to voice their concerns, and then they never really have anything to offer because most of it is from a reactionary point of view. Because automatically when you begin talking to men, everybody begins to feel attacked. Everybody begins to feel like, oh, you're personally saying this about me. Are you guilty? then that's the question you need to ask them when they begin with that. Are you guilty? Because, as Karen said, a lot of us, a lot of people, we know of abusers, we know of persons who would beat their children. I will admit that I grew up in a society that just kind of condoned violence. I was beaten as a child, so I became a mother. I automatically beat my child, and then after I would have been kind of, what's the word? Anyway, I would have become attuned to a lot of things then. I realized that that's not necessarily the way in which you kind of deal with these kind of problems. So we really need to look at that and just kind of shift the way in which we deal with our children particularly, because as we said, it starts from young, and the things we instill, because as we need to realize, when we instill these things in our children, they come up. As I said, I was beaten as a child, and I felt that it was necessary to kind of retaliate that same thing against my child, you know? And when we begin to question these things, we need to be sure that we move off from this point and not return to that. So men are definitely not really in the conversation. They need to be there, and when they're there, they need for it to not be from a reactionary standpoint. You need to be there to offer solidarity. You need to be there to offer solutions. But if your only aim there is to say not all men, then I don't feel like you have a place in this conversation to move us forward.
You know, I'm hoping that maybe next week I can get two men who would come and speak on this issue, and that's an open invitation. Akola mentioned this business about sexual assault, sexual harassment. It's become a big issue in the United States of America, from which unfortunately
it's a big issue all
the
over.
president of the United States seems to be exempt. He admitted to groping, he admitted to misogynistic, he admitted to anti-woman behavior. He said, "Oh, once you're big and famous, you can do these things."
Yeah, of course.
I'm hoping that's not going to be used as an excuse to ignore the behavior of higher ups.
Yes.
And public figures here.
But do you see any attempt? Because one can't think that it doesn't happen in our society. It happens, I guess, in all society. Do you see our society becoming more alert and opposed to things like that?
No, as I was saying, the Sexual Offences Act has a whole section on prevention, which expects a range of actions. It specifies a range of actions to be taken as preventive measures against sexual offences. I kept on saying that the judiciary is in fact trying to put its house in order and working to put its house in order. So we've had the Sexual Offences Court,
yes,
launched recently, and the Juris Project has released the guidelines, the model guidelines for sexual offences, for the hearing of sexual offences in the court, which recognize so that the courts will now behave in a way that complainants in the court are not re-victimized, which is what has happened, and this has prevented women who've been raped from going ahead with trials and so on, because the behavior in the court of defense counsel and so forth is horrendous. So this is supposed to be a Caribbean-wide project, or a number of countries in the Caribbean, and part of the function of the guidelines is to ensure that victim survivors are protected in the hearings, and of course protecting the rights of the defendants. So this is a move which hopefully is going to ensure that more rape trials go to completion, that more complainants stay with the cases so that they are tried in the court, recognizing that they will be treated, I guess, with decency in a way that
you're hoping about that from
well, the
defense attorneys.
That's why the judge is in place. So there's a whole slew of measures in the guidelines, and in our law. I mean, so our laws are in fact ahead of the guidelines in several instances.
Yes, because this is a Caribbean-wide guideline.
Yeah, and most of the countries don't have anything
domestic
to compare with our law. So I think things are going to change. I mean, the court is also going to accept that there is going to be some victim support through the trial, before, through, and after the trial. And again, that has to be paid for. So again, the government has to budget money to provide those kinds of support to these processes. That Sexual Offences Act requires the expenditure of a fair bit of money if it's going to be implemented properly. But they're not. The other piece of legislation that we really should be moving ahead on is the Juvenile Justice Bill, and that's at the moment going nowhere.
I've been hearing about that bill for a very long time now.
Yeah.
Now, we started talking Monica Reese story against the backdrop of the brutal murder and callous dumping, again with the parallels, of Kesia Branch. In the aftermath of the Monica Reese murder, there was this outrage by society. There was actually this organization that was formed. What kind of organized and institutional combination of response you think might be useful in a situation like this?
I don't know. I think that too often we put a lot of focus on organizational structures, and that kind of stymies the conversation a bit. I think that I'm not sure that there's one approach we can necessarily take to tackle this, because when you think about it, sexual assault and violence in general is not something that can easily be pinpointed. So when you're examining it, you need to make sure that you take holistic approaches. You need to attack it from every level. You need to look at the school systems, you need to look at family structures, you need to look at basically everything, because it's very important that we get it right. And if we're serious about eliminating or even just kind of minimizing the amount of sexual violence cases that there are, then I think we need to move away from this idea that we need set organizational structures with people at the top and people at the bottom and stuff like that, and just kind of form cohesive movements and just kind of look at everything at a holistic level, rather than just trying to focus on one thing. So I'm not sure that we will ever necessarily see this big change. I'm not particularly I'm not particularly idealistic. I don't think we will see that in this day and age, but I do think that the conversation is headed in the right direction. In a way, it has begun, and it's just our need now to sustain it and try to drive that.
Karen?
I don't know. I think.
And I like the word that Akola used. There ought to be a movement. There ought to be an outcry against this. It's almost lost its place even in the newspapers.
Yeah, and that's the
Should
thing.
that be?
That's the thing. We kind of move in news cycles. We just have the 2 seconds of outrage, and then we move on to the next thing. So it is to find a way to sustain a conversation, to sustain the work against violence, to sustain the insistence that we need to move more and more clearly into violence-free communities, that we have to push our institutions into doing the work that they're supposed to do. That's the work that has to be sustained.
Do you think the state, and we include the police here, I know we've singled out the police, but do you think the state has reacted sufficiently to this?
No, the state does not react to these social issues, as far as I can see, except if there is something that may embarrass them terribly.
True.
But no, the state is singularly unresponsive you know, and or I should say, you know, you may get a speech, you may get some kind of declaration, but in terms of the follow-up action, in terms of putting the institutional support in place, no, we have not seen that happening.
Do you sense that any compassion, any empathy, for any feeling for what the mother of this woman would be going through?
Kessia, I think they're too poor. They're not significant enough.
You said you have little hope.
Yeah, I do have very little hope, but as Karen says, socioeconomic factors do play a large role in the things we pay attention to. Kessia, she's a poor girl. We will forget this story very soon. There will be another Kessia, there will be another person just like her, and we will be right here again trying to say the very same things, but we need to, how do we move off from the conversation? Because when it comes to Kessia's mother now, that's why I was saying earlier, when it comes to reporting and journalism, you need to be very careful. You need to ensure that your story does not cause harm, unintended harm to the victim's family.
Yeah.
And you need to be very, very careful about that.
Yeah.
You need to be sensitive about that. So when you see stories in the media, journalists need to be very, very careful in the way they frame their stories. We need to realize that victims, they have families, and we need to realize that the public, whether we take responsibility for it or not, journalists have a very important role to play in the way society forms opinions and shapes those opinions.
We've come to the end of the program. Ms. Karen DeSouza, Ms. Akola Thompson, thank you so much for coming and speaking out on this issue concerning the brutal murder of Keshia Branch. We are told a wake is going to be held within the next couple of days, I think. I'm inviting the public to really show collective outrage against this. We've witnessed this more than 24 years ago. This ought to stop. I think the police have a duty to be far more proactive. We take some comfort from the fact that we are told that this will be solved. Let's hope it's solved, and let's hope it's solved very quickly. On that score, I want to say thank you again, operators and viewers. Thank you, and good night, and see you next week.